It's the oil in this part of Syria that is being protected by the United States. You can see the US convoy that we turned up in there. But ultimately, the end goal is a political solution and possibly some kind of autonomy for the Kurds. And it's this oil that will make that autonomy possible.
It's a small step in rebuilding the relationship with the Kurds after the October shock. But there is much work to be done.
My son's friend called me to say he was dying, but we were busy running from the bullets.
Ali was never able to recover his son's body. All he has left of him is his martyr's portrait and his 7-month-old daughter, Marianne.
Miriam.
The family, like too many in this country, now refugees in their own home.
Inside me, a fire is burning. All we can do is cry.
Some refuse to stay in these camps. It takes imagination to survive in Syria.
A lot of people, when they got pushed out of their homes, didn't want to go to camps, so they made their way to places like this, schools. There are more than 60 of these derelict schools where families are living. But it is not a place of learning. It is cold and damp, and these kids haven't learned anything in months.
This part of Syria are memories of October's war and the fallout it created. Yet another generation made homeless, yet more children fighting to survive. And looming on the horizon, perhaps yet more conflict to come. Lasgin has a long road to recovery. His only wish, to go abroad for treatment so he can rejoin his friends in the battles he knows aren't far away. Syria's Kurds have no nation to truly call their own, and they have many enemies. They're counting on their only ally to not let them down again.
They're the moderate rebel forces and have been funded, trained and armed by Turkey. Together with some other local moderate militias, it was thought they could mobilize up to 70,000 fighters, though it's likely there was no time to mobilize so many before Assad fell. Then there are the Kurds. Their army is the Syrian Democratic Forces. They were aided by the US in their fight against ISIS, but were openly fighting against Turkey and their militias. They were also hostile to Assad at some points in history, though for several years now that relationship became more amiable. It's thought their forces might currently number up to 50,000. Even though the majority of the SDF is holding the northeast of Syria, there was and is a Kurdish pocket right north of Aleppo. Reportedly, there were clashes between HTS and SDF there, but Kurds seem to be avoiding large-scale direct clashes with the HTS. Indeed, there has been news of HTS and SDF negotiating a peaceful withdrawal of Kurdish forces from northern Aleppo. But the bigger problem for the SDF is the Turkey-backed SNA. SNA forces surged from the north once the offensive started and took the town of Tal Rifat, which was held by the SDF. We may yet see a full-scale war between the SNA and Kurdish fighters in the future, if the transition of power doesn't go smoothly.
James Longman brings us this exclusive report.
23-year-old Lasgin may never walk again. He's a Kurdish SDF soldier, and in October he was near the front lines when Turkey invaded northern Syria.
We were in a house, we were in a group, and the airstrikes hit us.
Lasgin was fighting a battle he doesn't believe he would have needed to if the US hadn't abruptly changed course. He paid a heavy price, but he's still alive. Hayal was a medic who was killed in an airstrike as he was getting the injured to safety. A family's life shattered in an instant. His father fears his son won't be the last casualty the Turks take. He fully expects Turkey to be back a second, third, fourth time, but he says they'll be resilient and ready. And we met Sheikh Humus Ali Ahmed, a fourth-generation baker who lost his home, his job, and his son. All this at the hands of the Turks, who'd been threatening the move for years.
Syrian tyrant Bashar al-Assad traded his country's military secrets with Israel in exchange for safe passage out of the country, it has been claimed. The murderous tyrant allegedly handed over coordinates for weapons depots, which Israel are now using to drop bombs on Syrian targets. A journalist from Turkish newspaper Hurriyet said a reliable source told him that Assad handed over a list with the locations of weapons depots, missile systems and warplanes as a guarantee that Israel would not target him during his flight. Israel started dropping airstrikes on Syrian military strongholds soon after the fall of Assad's government, leading the reporter to claim that the traded list is likely true. He also claims there are other details about Assad's scramble to safety, which particularly concerns Israel's role, but hasn't elaborated on the details. Rebel forces in Syria launched their coup campaign in late November, and less than a fortnight later had stormed the capital Damascus, where they claimed victory. Assad fled in secret on a chopper to Russia, where fellow despot and pal Vladimir Putin has offered him refuge. Since then, the Israel Defense Forces have carried out countless strikes on what they say are weapons depots. Israel calls them preemptive strikes, intending to stop the weapons from falling into the hands of extremists.
But why were the rebels so successful? Well, it's not so much that they were good as it was that their opponent wasn't. Not just wasn't good, but wasn't as in wasn't there. In theory, Assad's forces around Aleppo should not have caved in. They likely had 10 or 20,000 troops in northern Syria and had heavy weapons. But those forces literally disintegrated and fled at the first sign of fighting.
Just weeks ago, Farhan al-Khuli was manning a military outpost in Idlib, northern Syria, for Bashar al-Assad's army. The story of his desertion, one of many, shows how Assad's army crumbled as the rebels advanced. Khuli's commanding officer called to say a rebel convoy was heading their way. They were just 3 men, badly paid and demoralized, one deemed unfit by his superiors to bear arms. They were meant to be 9, but others had bribed their way out. They should stand and fight, the officer said. Instead, Khuli put his phone on airplane mode, changed into civilian clothes, dropped his rifle and fled, ending up in Damascus, now taken by the rebels, where he got this job at a horse stable. On the road he saw other groups of deserting soldiers.
Those who were with me in the room, I no longer know anything about them. Everyone went in a different way. Some went this way, others went that way. I wanted to reach the highway, because if I reached the highway, I would no longer worry. I reached Home, I reached Homs. I have no problem. I saw all the people gathering. It was over. They fled. The whole area was gone. I said, praise be to God. I am here. By God Almighty. When they said that the whole area had fallen, I started to cry with joy.
Within 2 weeks, the rebels had toppled Assad's brutal regime. His army lacked leadership and a defense strategy, the sources said, and had lost much of its commanding structure, the Iranian military advisors and militia allies such as Hezbollah, who'd left as war with Israel escalated. The army also lacked loyalty, as Khuli's story describes. Khuli didn't want to sign up, but says he was forced to. He ended up at that remote post in Idlib because he'd tried to desert once and been jailed for it.
Many of them defected. It was just isolated small units that offered resistance. Assad's regime may have had 130,000 troops in 2024 on paper in total, but in reality it's clear a significant chunk of those were not even remotely loyal to Assad. After Aleppo fell, Assad raised salaries for the military by 50%. That's something of a desperate move in the context of it all, not a well-planned and calculated salary increase. Russia was initially using some of its jets stationed in Syria to bomb HTS positions, but most Russian assets, like crucial recon assets, have been tied elsewhere, in Ukraine. While a few hundred pro-Iranian militia fighters were observed crossing from Iraq into Syria during the early stage of the rebel offensive, it's obvious Iran did not do an organized militia run on Syria to prop up Assad. Maybe they were planning to do it, but were simply surprised by how quickly Assad fell. Iran also had to worry about Israel searching for their troops in Syria and bombing them. In the past, Israel has also often struck Assad's army targets. Even during this latest rebel offensive, Israel kept up some airstrikes, which may have had some small effect on the logistics of the Assad's regime and thus its ability to fight. The fact that Israel and Hezbollah were still sporadically exchanging fire and thus the Hezbollah fighters were tied up in Lebanon also did not help Assad. Basically, the period of success for Assad, mid to late 2010s, was a whole different period to late 2024, when he lost this much territory quickly. Assad then had help of over 30,000 outside fighters, which were for the most part motivated to fight and fairly well trained. He had Russian hardware support, as Russia was sending various quantities of weapons via ships to Syria. This November and December, there was less Russian recon support and there were very few outside fighters to help. The hardware help had not been coming in numbers since Turkey closed the exit for military shipments from the Black Sea a few years ago due to the war in Ukraine. Syria has been under economic sanctions for a decade and a half now. It used to make money from oil sales, but ISIS had at one point held most of those. After fighting ISIS, US forces and Kurdish forces took control of some oil-producing facilities. Basically, from 2011 to 2022, Syrian oil production fell by 91%. Assad's regime was hemorrhaging money. Who knows? Ultimately, it was probably the economic hardship caused by war and sanctions that also made so many Syrian troops lose trust in the government. Eventually, they gave up.
What a painful sight for President Vladimir Putin. The troops he sent to Syria to shore up Russian influence in the Middle East 9 years ago, forced to retreat, moving in convoy along the road north from Damascus this morning. For Syrians watching them pass, not so painful. Without Russian support, Bashar al-Assad would probably have fallen long ago.
Tell me what you're feeling watching the Russians go past.
نصر كبير وفرحة الحمد لله قتلونا ودمرونا الحمد لله.
We passed scores of vehicles, a column that continued for several kilometers, an organized retreat. And then they were forced to stop. One vehicle with a flat tire, and they all ground to a halt. The Russian military is notoriously camera shy, but today avoiding us was a low priority, although they didn't want to talk. At their height, the Russians had some 5,000 troops on the ground in Syria. Many were withdrawn when they invaded Ukraine in 2022. Here they were infamous for the destruction they wreaked from the air. But that's all over. The rebels they've been fighting are now the ones in power. In Damascus, the new prime minister was fighting through not Russians, but crowds of well-wishers to get into the Umayyad mosque for Friday prayers. During the scenes of mass jubilation, the man who led the militia that toppled Assad, shedding both his jihadi name and uniform, put out a statement calling for sober and responsible celebration.
أود أن أبارك للشعب السوري العظيم انتصار الثورة المباركة وأدعوهم للنزول إلى الميادين للتعبير عن فرحتهم بذلك دون إطلاق الرصاص وترويع الناس ثم بعد ذلك لنتجه إلى بناء هذا البلد وكما قلناها منذ البداية منصور بعون الله والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
And head to the squares they did after Friday prayers. The biggest crowds were in Damascus, but all over the country people came out to celebrate the downfall of the Assad regime just 5 days ago. So much has happened since then, an entire nation transformed, looking back in pain and forward in hope. Syrians may be happy to see the Russians go, but other regional powers are jostling to take their place, stepping into the void left by decades of dictatorship and war.
Our top story tonight on Gravitas is about Syria. Bashar al-Assad is gone and Syria has suddenly become the principal battlefield. It is being targeted by three powers: America, Israel and Turkey. But what's really driving these moves, and who at the end of the day stands to gain from all of this? Tonight, we break down the major power plays and the agendas triggering actions that could shape Syria's future. A country already battered by more than a decade of civil war that now finds itself at the epicenter of fresh turmoil. The sudden collapse of Bashar al-Assad's regime has triggered a whirlwind of chaos as the United States, Israel and Turkey unleash firepower across Syrian territory. In fact, the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan reportedly said that the country will not allow the Kurdish PKK or ISIS to gain from Syria's upheaval. Backed by the Turkish military, the Syrian National Army reportedly launched ground assaults on Kurdish forces in Manbij, Aleppo province. As per reports, these assaults were also supported by Turkish drones and warplanes that left at least 20 Kurdish fighters dead and 40 injured. Ankara insists its operations are defensive and aimed at neutralizing terrorist threats.
Turkey has no eye on the territory of any other country. The only aim for our cross-border operation is to save our citizens and our homeland from the terrorist attacks. Neither the PKK and its extensions in Syria nor Daesh are the representatives of our country. On the contrary, they are its enemies. The territorial integrity of Syria should be protected at all costs.
Now, Erdogan's rhetoric, claiming Turkey has no interest in Syrian territory, does not quite align with the reality on the ground. You see, with nearly 3 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, Ankara has vested interest in shaping Syria's future, not just to address its refugee crisis, but also to expand its regional clout. As per reports, Israeli planes bombed at least 3 major Syrian army air bases that housed dozens of helicopters and jets. The strikes hit the Kamishli air base in northeast Syria, the Shinshar base in Homs, and Akraba airport southwest of Damascus. As you can see in this video, several explosions and heavy smoke billowing after Israeli strikes targeted the ammunition and arms depot of the Syrian army near Kamishli. As per reports, Israeli military also carried out multiple strikes on Damascus. And like we said yesterday, Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar justified strikes in Syria as necessary to prevent Syria's advanced weaponry from falling into the wrong hands. But by destroying over 250 military sites since Assad's fall, is Israel just neutralizing threats? Or is this aggressive stance a warning to Iran and Hezbollah, longtime players in Syria's proxy wars?
Let's start with Madeline Rivera in Washington with the latest on what's going on in Syria and the reaction in Washington. Maddie, good morning.
Good morning, Carly. President Biden is looking at the situation in Syria with cautious optimism. The U.S. is waiting to see what leadership group will fill the vacuum left by President Bashar al-Assad.
It's a moment of historic opportunity for the long-suffering people of Syria to build a better future for their proud country.
Moving forward, the president says the U.S. will engage with different Syrian groups, though he notes some of the rebels have their own ties of terrorism. Administration officials also say they need to make sure there is no resurgence of ISIS. To that end, yesterday, the U.S. launched dozens of strikes on more than 75 ISIS targets in central Syria. General Michael Eric Corella says there should be no doubt we will not allow ISIS to reconstitute and take advantage of the current situation in Syria. The U.S. has another priority, securing the chemical weapons possessed by the Assad government, preventing them from getting into the wrong hands. Still, the Biden administration says it has no intentions of intervening militarily. On that point, the administration and President-elect Trump agree. Trump says the U.S. should stay out of the fight in Syria, and like the president, he believes Russia's abandonment of Assad led to his downfall. Trump says now is the time for Russia to negotiate a ceasefire deal with Ukraine. Carly.
All right, Madeline Rivera live for us in Washington. Maddie, thank you so much. Let's bring in research fellow at the Foundation for Democracies, for Defense of Democracies, rather, Hussein Abdul Hussein. Good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. So this rebel group that has taken over is a designated terrorist organization that had links to al-Qaeda. So how does this news out of the Middle East impact us here at home?
Good morning, Carly. Well, we saw the president, the chief of this organization, coming on an interview and promising that he has changed and regretting what he's done in the past, to an extent saying that he was too young and immature. He almost said all the right things, but we can't really judge him by his words. We have to wait and judge him by his deeds. So far, I don't see any alarming signs for us here at home, but we never know what happens. We're still too early on, and things are still changing at a rapid pace at this point.
So yesterday, the U.S. launched airstrikes against ISIS camps inside Syria, and the message being, don't even think about reconstituting and using this crisis and turmoil as an opportunity. When it comes to ISIS, where are we right now?
Well, ISIS has been trying to reconstitute for a long time. The fact that we had targets and we had not taken them out for some time tells us that we've been monitoring them, that they have been trying to come back, and that we still have them on the radar, which is a good point. We're still focused on ISIS. I don't see them really coming back as they did in the summer of 2014, but they are certainly a threat. And with a new Islamist group taking over in Damascus, I think they might think that this is the good opportunity for them to come back and to start doing whatever they were doing 10 years ago.
While many Syrians celebrate, others continue their desperate search for loved ones disappeared by Assad's brutal regime. When the doors of the country's prisons were thrown open, it led to joyful reunions for some, but heartbreak for others. And many are still searching for answers, clinging to the hope that their missing relatives are alive, as our Foreign Affairs correspondent Porrick O'Brien explains in this report, which contains graphic and upsetting images.
Bashar al-Assad's father enlisted a former Nazi officer to design his intelligence and torture operation. One of its pillars, Sednaya prison. Thousands freed from there on Sunday. Now imagine what it would have been like in the days after the Nazi concentration camps were liberated. Imagine the surrounding hospitals and morgues filling up, the search for the missing. Tragically, no need to imagine anymore. All day long outside Al-Mushtahid Hospital, people come to try to find their loved ones among the pictures of the dead. Khader's father was detained 12 years ago. His face is not on the wall, so still no closure.
انت قد ما رح تحكي انت ما رح تحسني توصفي اي شعور جواتك 12 سنه انت عايشه بعرق كبيره ما بتعرفي عنه شيء انت عم تاكلي بس ما عندك.
Inside the hospital morgue, people step around the corpses on the floor. Some have been detained for so long they look different. Aging and torture makes them harder to identify. The deputy coroner explains.
لقينا في حالات طلق ناري بالمنطقة القفوية بالصدر لقينا حالات تعذيب in this room.
After 12 years of war, Dr. Al-Qasim has seen a lot, but this is different.
يعني في منظر أنا كأطباء شرعيين نحن مر علينا سابقا بالسنوات السابقة مر علينا حالات كثيرة فينا نقول إنه هذا عذب أو فينا نقول إنه هذا كذا ولكن مثل هيك لسه نحن يعني في مفاجآت كثيرة ما بنعرفها.
At another hospital, Ibn al-Nafis, we hear there's a freed prisoner being treated. We pass another notice board for the would-be bereaved.
There are just 10 detainees in this hospital. Yesterday, this is the list of people who put their names down saying they'd lost loved ones that they were looking for.
Inside, the former detainee's room is full of people. More keep coming. The man they're talking about doesn't speak. He appears severely mentally impaired. No one knows his name.
بس بيشبه اخي مشان هيك
He cannot give consent to be filmed by us, but his doctors told us to publicize his presence here. In the absence of DNA testing kits, there is no way to identify him. We don't know how severe this man's condition was before Sednaya prison. We do know that the torture administered there was of the most extreme kind. Torture that continues for those holding on to the hope of connecting to those they love.
I want to begin with the very latest as it relates to these airstrikes. We've been looking at the fall of the Assad regime, and we see that Israeli Defense Forces are not letting up as it relates to the back and forth between what could be potential military grabs as it relates to different warehouses where their artillery is held. Can you set the stage for this, please?
Yeah, absolutely. As you mentioned, the Assad regime collapsed about a week ago or so, and now you have all of these groups vying for control there in Syria. And it's very important to Israel that these groups, a lot of them identified actually as terrorists by the U.S. administration, by the U.S. government, don't get their hands on some of these Assad weapons. You're talking about chemical weapons. You're talking about surface-to-surface missiles. These weapons can do major damage against the Israeli population centers. So Israel has established a buffer zone, in addition to the airstrikes, have established a buffer zone in the northern part of the Golan on the Syrian side.
Assad is gone, having flown to Russia in secret. Russia struck a deal with the rebels to allow them to peacefully withdraw its forces from the bases it once held. Basically, Russia also lost in Syria. Iran probably still hopes it will somehow keep some influence in Syria. For them, Assad himself wasn't important. What Iran needs is an unbroken tract of territory from Iran to Lebanon where Muslim Shia population would live. Hoping to leverage their support as always, Iran hopes to still smuggle weapons and supplies to Hezbollah. That was easy under Assad, who officially sanctioned it. But if the new government is against it, then the supply routes might have to be done more covertly, thus likely complicating things. Iran is thus worse off, but Israel is better off. This change will plausibly have Hezbollah receive less support, supplies and weapons from Iran. Israel already started bombing remaining stockpiles of weapons and hardware in Syria. It evidently doesn't want any sort of meaningful military at its doorstep, no matter who ends up leading it. Israel also took the opportunity and took some further Syrian territory, enlarging its Golan Heights buffer zone. In the north, the Kurds too took some more territory, largely desert towards the south. The US profited insomuch that there is no more Russian influence, but perhaps the biggest winner is Turkey, which may get to influence the new government in Syria. In the near future, Kurds may be in a precarious situation. They didn't like Assad, but they may grow to hate his replacement even more. Right now, it remains to be seen how various rebel factions will work together. Will HTS transition into a political power as a moderate force? Or will it show its jihadist roots? Will the remaining Syrian population, specifically the Alawites, feel retribution by the new people in power? The future of Syria is uncertain. While a dream of a fairly peaceful change of regime and no more war exists, history has taught us that it's much more likely various interest factions will simply prolong the suffering and that many parts of Syria may still see war for many years to come.